Some moments arrive disguised as ordinary encounters, slipping into our lives without fanfare or warning. For Sarah Jones, a 23-year-old waitress balancing 2 jobs and night school, Tuesday evening at Romano's Bistro seemed destined to be just another shift in an endless parade of demanding customers and modest tips. For Marcus Blackwood, the billionaire tech mogul whose face graced magazine covers and whose empire spanned continents, it was supposed to be a quiet dinner meeting, nothing more than another business transaction in his carefully orchestrated world. Neither could have predicted that a single act of courage would shatter the invisible walls between their worlds, revealing truths that would challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, power, and the price of standing up for what's right. The evening air hung thick with the scent of garlic and rosemary as Sarah wiped down the marble counter at Romano's Bistro. The restaurant buzzed with its usual Tuesday crowd, a mix of business professionals unwinding after long days and couples celebrating modest milestones. She had been on her feet for 6 hours straight, her uniform crisp despite the demanding pace, her smile genuine even as exhaustion tugged at the corners of her consciousness. The tips tonight had been decent, enough to cover her textbooks for next semester if she was careful with her spending. At table 12 sat a woman in her mid-40s, her designer blazer impeccably tailored, her jewellery subtle but expensive. Patricia Kellerman was a regular, though not the kind that servers particularly enjoyed. She had a habit of treating the staff as invisible fixtures rather than human beings, her voice carrying that particular tone of entitlement that comes from never having to wonder where your next meal will come from. Tonight she was dining with 2 associates, their conversation peppered with corporate jargon and self-important laughter. The trouble began when John, a shy college student working his first week as a busboy, accidentally bumped Patricia's chair while clearing the adjacent table. A few drops of water from his pitcher landed on her silk scarf, creating small, dark spots that would likely disappear within minutes. The collision was minor, the kind of innocent mistake that happens dozens of times in any busy restaurant on any given night. Patricia's reaction was anything but proportional. Her voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. She turned in her seat, her eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to draw energy from some deeper well of frustration. John stood frozen, the pitcher trembling in his hands, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing panic. He stammered an apology, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to make amends. But Patricia was just getting started. Her voice rose another octave, drawing stares from nearby tables. She berated the young man with a viciousness that went far beyond the scope of his mistake, attacking not just his competence, but his worth as a human being. She questioned his intelligence, his upbringing, his right to work in an establishment that served people of her caliber. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, delivered with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of verbal cruelty. The restaurant began to fall silent, conversations dying as diners turned to witness the spectacle. John looked as though he might cry, his hands shaking so violently that he had to set down the pitcher before he dropped it. The manager was nowhere to be seen, likely dealing with some crisis in the kitchen. The other servers moved nervously, unsure whether to intervene or maintain the professional distance their jobs demanded. Sarah felt something ignite in her chest, a burning sense of injustice that overwhelmed her usual caution. She had watched John during his first week, seen how hard he worked, how carefully he tried to learn every detail of his job. He was putting himself through college just as she was, grinding through long hours to build a future that seemed perpetually just out of reach. He didn't deserve this public humiliation, and certainly not over something so trivial. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but firm as she addressed Patricia. She apologised on behalf of the restaurant and offered to have the scarf professionally cleaned at their expense. Her tone was respectful, but not servile, acknowledging the incident without accepting the disproportionate response it had generated. Patricia turned her fury on Sarah with the speed of a striking snake. She demanded to know who Sarah thought she was, questioning her authority to speak and her competence to work in a respectable establishment. The attack was personal and vicious, designed to put Sarah back in what Patricia considered her proper place. She threatened to have both John and Sarah fired to ensure they never worked in the service industry again. But Sarah didn't back down. Instead, she stood straighter, her voice gaining strength as she defended both herself and John. She pointed out that accidents happen in any workplace, that the damage was minimal and easily remedied, and that treating hard-working people with basic dignity shouldn't be too much to ask from anyone, regardless of their station in life. Her words were measured but powerful, carrying the weight of someone who had faced adversity and refused to be diminished by it. The confrontation might have continued escalating, but it was interrupted by a slow, deliberate sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Someone was clapping. At a corner table that had been occupied so quietly most people hadn't noticed it, a man rose to his feet. He was tall and distinguished, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his presence commanding without being ostentatious. His applause continued, steady and purposeful, as every eye in the restaurant turned toward him. There was something in his bearing that suggested wealth and power, but also something deeper, more complex. As he approached their table, Patricia's demeanour shifted dramatically. The colour drained from her face as recognition dawned. This wasn't just any customer witnessing her outburst. This was Marcus Blackwood, the billionaire entrepreneur whose companies had revolutionised 3 different industries before his 40th birthday. His face had been on the cover of Time magazine just last month, his net worth the subject of endless speculation and debate. Marcus stopped directly in front of their table, his gaze moving deliberately from Patricia to Sarah to the still trembling John. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from being accustomed to having rooms fall silent when you enter them. But there was something else in his tone, something that suggested this moment had touched something personal and profound. He addressed Sarah first, thanking her for demonstrating the kind of courage that seemed increasingly rare in the world. He spoke about the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, about the dignity that every person deserves regardless of their job title or bank account balance. His words were simple but carried tremendous weight, delivered with the conviction of someone who had learned these lessons through hard experience. Then he turned to Patricia, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He didn't raise his voice, didn't resort to the kind of personal attacks she had unleashed on the staff. Instead, he spoke about power and responsibility, about the kind of character that reveals itself in how we treat those who serve us. He mentioned that he had been watching the entire exchange, had seen exactly how she had chosen to wield her perceived authority. Patricia tried to recover, to explain herself, or perhaps to curry favour with this unexpected witness to her behaviour. But Marcus wasn't interested in her justifications. He had seen enough to form his judgment, and that judgment was clearly unfavourable. The woman who had seemed so formidable just moments before now appeared small and defensive, her bluster evaporating under the steady gaze of someone whose opinion actually mattered in the circle she desperately wanted to be part of. But it was what happened next that would change everything for Sarah. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a simple business card, extending it to her with a slight smile that suggested this encounter had affected him more deeply than his composed exterior revealed. He told her that people with her kind of integrity were exactly what his companies needed, that courage like hers was far more valuable than any degree or credential. The card was elegant in its simplicity, bearing only his name and a phone number. But Sarah recognised the implications immediately. This wasn't just a networking opportunity or a polite gesture. This was a door opening to possibilities she had never dared to imagine, offered by someone whose resources could literally change the course of her life. As Marcus prepared to leave, he paused to speak quietly with John the busboy, offering words of encouragement and perspective that helped restore some of the young man's shaken confidence. Then he approached the manager, who had finally emerged from the kitchen to find his restaurant buzzing with whispered conversations about what had just transpired. The conversation between Marcus Blackwood and the manager was brief but intense, conducted in tones too low for most patrons to hear. However, the result was clear enough when the manager approached Patricia's table with a grave expression and quietly informed her that Romano's would no longer be able to accommodate her business. Patricia left in a fury, her associates trailing behind her with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their own association with someone who had just been so publicly dressed down by one of the most powerful men in the country. The restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the undercurrent of excitement remained. Staff members kept glancing at Sarah with expressions of admiration and curiosity, while patrons whispered among themselves about the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. Sarah stood holding the business card, her hands trembling slightly as the full magnitude of what had just occurred began to sink in. In the space of 20 minutes, she had gone from being just another waitress grinding through another shift to holding what might be the key to an entirely different future. The billionaire's reaction to her simple act of decency had revealed something profound about both of them, setting in motion events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, opportunity, and the hidden connections that bind our lives together. The card felt impossibly light in her palm, yet she could sense the weight of the decision it represented. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to make that call, to step through the door that Marcus Blackwood had opened for her. But tonight, as her shift wound toward its close, Sarah found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the world and her place within it. The remainder of her shift passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Fellow servers approached her with expressions that mixed awe and curiosity, their voices hushed as they asked what Marcus Blackwood had said, what the card meant, whether she really intended to call the number printed in elegant script across its surface. Sarah found herself deflecting most of their questions, not out of secrecy, but because she genuinely didn't know the answers herself. John the busboy had recovered somewhat from his earlier humiliation, though Sarah noticed he moved with extra care around the remaining tables, his confidence still fragile from Patricia's verbal assault. During a brief lull between orders, he approached Sarah with tears still glistening in his eyes, his gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. He thanked her repeatedly, his voice thick with emotion as he tried to express what her intervention had meant to him. The young man came from a family that had immigrated 3 years earlier, his parents working multiple jobs to support his education while he struggled with the language and customs of a country that still felt foreign. Tonight's humiliation had awakened every insecurity, every doubt about whether he belonged in this world of white tablecloths and entitled customers. Sarah's defense of him had been more than professional courtesy. It had been an affirmation of his worth as a human being. As Sarah listened to his halting words of thanks, she realized that her actions had created ripples far beyond what she had initially understood. Her decision to speak up hadn't just been about fairness or dignity in the abstract, it had been about recognizing the shared humanity that connected all of them, regardless of their backgrounds or bank accounts. The restaurant began to empty as the evening progressed, the dinner crowd giving way to the quieter atmosphere of late-night coffee and dessert orders. Sarah found herself mechanically performing her closing duties while her mind churned through the implications of the evening's events. The business card remained tucked safely in her apron pocket, but its presence seemed to radiate through the fabric, a constant reminder of the choice that awaited her. She thought about her current trajectory, the careful calculations that governed every aspect of her life. Her morning shift at the coffee shop started at 6, followed by afternoon classes at the community college, then evening shifts at Romano's that often stretched past midnight. It was a grinding routine that left little room for spontaneity or dreams, but it was also predictable, manageable, safe. She knew exactly how many more semesters she needed to complete her business degree, exactly how much money she needed to save each month to make her car payments and cover her share of the rent in the cramped apartment she shared with 2 roommates. The card in her pocket represented the possibility of stepping off that predetermined path into something unknown and potentially extraordinary. But it also represented risk, the terrifying prospect of leaving behind the security of her carefully constructed plans for the uncertainty of a world she knew nothing about. As she wiped down the last table and counted her tips for the evening, Sarah tried to imagine what kind of opportunity Marcus Blackwood might have in mind. His companies were involved in everything from renewable energy to artificial intelligence, employing thousands of people in roles she could barely comprehend. What possible use could a billionaire tech mogul have for a part-time waitress with an unfinished degree and no relevant experience? The more she thought about it, the more surreal the entire evening began to seem. Perhaps she had misread the situation, misunderstood the significance of his gesture. Maybe the business card was simply a polite acknowledgement of her actions, a way of saying thank you without any real expectation that she would follow through. Rich people probably handed out business cards all the time, she reasoned, the way normal people exchange pleasantries about the weather. But even as she tried to rationalize away the importance of what had happened, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the look in Marcus Blackwood's eyes when he handed her the card. There had been something deliberate about the gesture, something that suggested he saw qualities in her that she hadn't recognized in herself. The way he had spoken about courage and integrity hadn't felt like empty flattery. It had carried the weight of genuine conviction. Her manager, Tony, appeared at her shoulder as she finished organizing the condiment station. He was a kind man in his 50s who had worked in restaurants his entire adult life, climbing slowly from busboy to owner through decades of 12-hour days and weekend shifts. His face bore the lines of someone who had seen every possible drama play out in dining rooms, but even he seemed shaken by the evening's events. He pulled her aside, his voice low and serious as he thanked her for handling the situation with such grace. Patricia Kellerman had been a problem customer for months, he admitted, her complaints and demands growing more unreasonable with each visit. But her spending and her connections to other wealthy patrons had made her difficult to confront directly. Tonight's incident had finally provided the justification he needed to ban her from the restaurant, though he acknowledged it was Sarah's courage that had forced his hand. Tony also shared something that made Sarah's pulse quicken. After Marcus Blackwood had finished his conversation with him, he had asked several specific questions about Sarah. How long had she worked at Romano's? What were her career aspirations? Did she seem like someone who could handle increased responsibility? The question suggested a level of genuine interest that went far beyond casual politeness. As Sarah drove home through the empty streets, her mind continued to race through possibilities and scenarios. The city looked different somehow, as if the evening's events had shifted her perspective on everything around her. The familiar landmarks of her daily routine seemed smaller, more limited, while the gleaming towers of the downtown business district appeared more accessible than they ever had before. Her apartment was dark when she arrived, her roommates already asleep. Sarah made her way quietly to her small bedroom, finally allowing herself to examine the business card under the light of her desk lamp. The paper was thick and expensive, the kind of quality that spoke of serious business and substantial resources. The name Marcus Blackwood was printed in simple, elegant letters, followed by a phone number with no other identifying information. No company name, no title, no address, just the essential elements of contact. She set the card on her nightstand and stared at it while she changed out of her work uniform. The simple rectangle of paper seemed to pulse with possibility, representing a crossroads she had never expected to encounter. On one side lay the path she had always known, the steady grind toward a modest degree and a modest career in a modest life. On the other side lay the unknown, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Sleep eluded her for hours as she lay in bed replaying every moment of the evening's encounter. She analysed Marcus Blackwood's words, searching for clues about his intentions and expectations. She thought about Patricia Kellerman's fury and the way it had crumbled under the billionaire's quiet disapproval. She remembered the look of gratitude in young John's eyes and wondered if she would have been brave enough to act if she had known the full consequences of her intervention. But beneath all the analysis and speculation was a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted within her. The woman who had stood up to Patricia Kellerman wasn't the same person who had started her shift that evening. Somewhere in the process of defending John and asserting her own dignity, she had discovered reserves of strength and conviction she hadn't known she possessed. The next morning arrived with the harsh insistence of her alarm clock, pulling her from restless dreams into the familiar routine of another day. But as Sarah prepared for her morning shift at the coffee shop, the business card seemed to watch her from the nightstand, a silent reminder that routine was now a choice rather than an inevitability. The coffee shop smelled of burnt espresso and unfulfilled dreams, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision, steaming milk and grinding beans while her thoughts remained anchored to the events of the previous evening. The business card had found its way into her wallet, tucked behind her driver's license where she could feel its presence but remain hidden from curious eyes. Her co-worker Jennifer noticed her distraction immediately. Jennifer was 26 and had been working at the coffee shop for 3 years. Her initial plans to save money for nursing school gradually eroded by the relentless demands of rent and survival. She possessed the sharp intuition of someone who had learned to read people's moods as a matter of professional necessity, and Sarah's barely contained energy was impossible to miss. During the morning rush, as they worked side by side filling orders for bleary-eyed commuters, Jennifer peppered Sarah with questions. Had something happened at her evening job? Was she feeling all right? Did she need to talk about anything? Sarah deflected these inquiries with vague responses about being tired, but she could feel Jennifer's concerned gaze following her throughout their shift. The morning crowd was its usual mixture of office workers grabbing caffeine before disappearing into glass towers and students nursing single cups of coffee while hunched over laptops. Sarah served them with her customary efficiency, but part of her attention was elsewhere, imagining what it would be like to walk into one of those gleaming office buildings as something more than a visitor delivering takeout orders. By 10 o'clock, the rush had subsided, leaving Sarah and Jennifer with the slower pace of mid-morning regulars. It was then that Sarah's phone rang, the number unknown but local. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she excused herself to take the call in the small break room behind the counter. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to someone who clearly worked in an environment where time was measured in billable hours rather than coffee breaks. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Martinez, executive assistant to Marcus Blackwood, and asked if Sarah would be available for a meeting that afternoon at 2 o'clock. Sarah's mouth went dry as she processed the request. She had expected that calling the number on the business card would be her decision to make, her first step across the threshold into whatever opportunity Marcus Blackwood had in mind. She hadn't anticipated that he would take the initiative, that her actions the previous evening had already set wheels in motion beyond her control. Rebecca's tone was polite but efficient as she provided an address in the heart of the financial district, explaining that Mr. Blackwood had been impressed by Sarah's character and wanted to discuss a potential opportunity. When Sarah mentioned that she would need to request time off from work, Rebecca smoothly offered to have someone call the coffee shop manager to ensure there would be no complications with her schedule. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but by the time Sarah returned to the counter, her entire world had shifted again. Jennifer took one look at her pale face and wide eyes and immediately demanded an explanation. Unable to contain the magnitude of what was happening any longer, Sarah found herself recounting the entire story of the previous evening while they prepared orders for the handful of customers scattered throughout the shop. Jennifer's reactions evolved from skepticism to amazement to concern as Sarah described the confrontation with Patricia Kellerman, Marcus Blackwood's intervention, and the business card that had led to this morning's phone call. When Sarah mentioned the meeting scheduled for that afternoon, Jennifer's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and worry that perfectly mirrored Sarah's own conflicted emotions. The practical concerns came flooding out as they talked. What would Sarah wear to meet with one of the most powerful men in the country? How should she prepare for a conversation when she had no idea what kind of opportunity he had in mind? What if this was all some elaborate misunderstanding, and she embarrassed herself in front of someone whose opinion could influence her future in ways she couldn't even comprehend? Jennifer, despite her own modest circumstances, proved to be an invaluable ally in addressing these concerns. She volunteered to let Sarah borrow her best interview outfit, a navy blazer and matching skirt that she had worn to exactly one job interview 3 years earlier. She also insisted on researching Marcus Blackwood online, pulling up articles and interviews that might provide insight into his business philosophy and personal interests. What they discovered was both reassuring and intimidating. Marcus Blackwood had built his fortune through a combination of technological innovation and strategic acquisitions, but he was also known for his unconventional hiring practices and his belief in promoting people based on character rather than credentials alone. Several articles mentioned his habit of finding exceptional employees in unexpected places, from promoting a security guard to head of operations to hiring a customer service representative who became one of his most trusted advisors. The pattern suggested that Sarah's lack of traditional qualifications might not be the obstacle she had feared. But it also raised the stakes of the meeting exponentially. If Marcus Blackwood was known for recognizing hidden potential in unlikely candidates, then this afternoon's conversation would be her audition for a role she couldn't even imagine yet. As her shift at the coffee shop neared its end, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anxiety mixed with anticipation that had become her constant companion since the previous evening. She had navigated challenges before, worked multiple jobs while maintaining her grades, supported herself through sheer determination and careful planning. But those challenges had been predictable, manageable through hard work and persistence. This was different, a leap into a realm where the rules were unfamiliar and the stakes were higher than anything she had encountered before. The address Rebecca had provided led to a sleek glass tower that rose 40 stories above the bustling streets of the financial district. The building's lobby was a study in understated elegance, all marble and chrome with abstract artwork that probably cost more than Sarah's annual tuition. Security guards in immaculate uniforms checked identification with the polite efficiency of people accustomed to protecting valuable assets and important secrets. Sarah's borrowed outfit felt appropriate in these surroundings, though she remained acutely aware that she was venturing far outside her natural habitat. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor seemed to last forever, each ascending floor marking her progression into a world where decisions were made that affected thousands of lives and billions of dollars. The reception area for Marcus Blackwood's offices was surprisingly warm despite its obvious expense, with comfortable seating arranged around low tables adorned with fresh flowers and current magazines. Rebecca Martinez greeted Sarah with a genuine smile that helped ease some of her nervousness, explaining that Mr. Blackwood was finishing up a conference call but would be available shortly. While she waited, Sarah tried to absorb details about her surroundings that might provide clues about what to expect. The walls displayed a carefully curated collection of photographs showcasing various projects and achievements from Marcus Blackwood's companies. There were images of solar installations in developing countries, research laboratories where scientists worked on breakthrough technologies, and facilities where innovative products were manufactured by workers who appeared genuinely engaged in their tasks. What struck Sarah most about these displays was their focus on human impact rather than financial returns. The photographs told stories of problems solved and lives improved, suggesting that Marcus Blackwood's business philosophy extended beyond mere profit maximization. This observation provided some comfort as she prepared for a conversation that could reshape her entire future. When Rebecca finally escorted her into Marcus Blackwood's office, Sarah was surprised by its relative modesty. While the space was undeniably elegant and the view of the city spectacular, it felt more like the workspace of a thoughtful executive than the throne room of a billionaire. Books lined one wall, ranging from business strategy to philosophy to biographies of historical figures. A simple wooden desk held neat stacks of documents and a laptop computer, while comfortable chairs were arranged around a small conference table near the windows. Marcus Blackwood rose from behind his desk as she entered, his greeting warm but professional. He was dressed more casually than she had expected, his expensive suit replaced by khakis and a button-down shirt that suggested this meeting was important enough to merit his full attention but informal enough to put her at ease. His handshake was firm without being overwhelming, and his smile carried the same genuine quality she remembered from their encounter at Romano's Bistro. As they settled into chairs at the conference table, Marcus began the conversation with questions about her background and aspirations. His approach was conversational rather than interrogational, creating an atmosphere that encouraged honesty rather than performance. Sarah found herself talking about her childhood in a working-class family, her parents' struggles to provide opportunities she hadn't taken for granted, and her determination to build something meaningful from the modest foundation they had provided. She described her current juggling act between multiple jobs and night school, explaining her plans to complete her business degree and eventually find work in corporate management. The words felt small and inadequate in this setting, her modest ambitions seeming almost childish when spoken in an office where global strategies were planned and implemented. But Marcus listened with an attention that suggested he found her story genuinely interesting rather than merely polite conversation. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he was processing not just the facts she shared, but the character traits they revealed. Her work ethic, her sense of responsibility, her willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term goals, all became topics for exploration rather than assumptions to be glossed over. When he finally explained why he had requested this meeting, Marcus's words carried the weight of someone who had given considerable thought to what he was about to propose. He spoke about the challenge of finding employees who possessed both competence and integrity, particularly in positions that required making difficult decisions under pressure. Technical skills could be taught, he explained, but character was either present or absent from the beginning. The previous evening's incident had revealed something about Sarah's character that impressed him more than any resume or recommendation letter could have accomplished. Her willingness to intervene on behalf of someone who couldn't defend himself, her refusal to be intimidated by someone wielding social and economic power, and her ability to maintain professionalism while standing firm on principle had demonstrated qualities he valued above conventional qualifications. What he was offering, he explained, was an opportunity to join his organization in a role that would allow her to develop her potential while contributing to projects that could make a meaningful difference in the world. The position would require her to leave behind the familiar certainties of her current life, to trust in her ability to learn and grow in ways she had never attempted before. The conversation continued for over an hour, ranging from practical concerns about salary and benefits to philosophical discussions about the responsibility that comes with power and influence. Marcus shared stories from his own career, moments when he had taken risks that seemed foolish to others but had ultimately defined his path to success. He spoke about failures as well as victories, acknowledging that growth required a willingness to venture beyond the boundaries of comfort and certainty. By the time their meeting concluded, Sarah understood that she was being offered more than just a job. She was being invited to step into a version of herself that she had never dared to imagine, to discover capabilities that had remained dormant throughout her years of careful planning and modest expectations. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it was also terrifying in its scope and implications. As she rode the elevator back down to the street level, Sarah's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who looked simultaneously excited and overwhelmed. The business card that had started this journey now seemed like a quaint artifact from a simpler time, when her biggest decision was whether to call an unknown number rather than whether to accept an offer that could transform her entire existence. The city streets buzzed with their usual afternoon energy as Sarah emerged from the glass tower, but the familiar sounds seemed muted, as if she were experiencing the world through a filter of disbelief. The weight of Marcus Blackwood's offer pressed against her consciousness like a physical presence, reshaping her understanding of what was possible in ways that left her feeling simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. She found herself walking without direction, her feet carrying her through the financial district while her mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The position Marcus had described wasn't simply a job upgrade or a career advancement. It was an invitation to step into a completely different realm of existence, one where her decisions would affect budgets larger than her hometown's annual revenue, and where her mistakes could have consequences she couldn't even comprehend yet. The salary alone was staggering. More than triple what she currently earned from both her jobs combined. But beyond the financial transformation, Marcus had painted a picture of work that mattered, projects that could genuinely improve lives rather than simply generate profits. He had spoken of renewable energy initiatives in developing countries, educational programs that provided opportunities to underserved communities, and technological innovations that could address some of humanity's most pressing challenges. What struck her most profoundly was his emphasis on the learning opportunities the position would provide. Rather than expecting her to arrive fully formed and competent, he had outlined a comprehensive development program that would expose her to every aspect of his organization's operations. She would rotate through different divisions, work alongside experts in fields ranging from engineering to international relations, and gradually assume increasing levels of responsibility as her capabilities expanded. The trust implicit in such an offer was almost overwhelming. Marcus Blackwood was essentially betting on her potential rather than her proven abilities, investing significant resources in someone whose qualifications existed primarily in her character rather than her credentials. The responsibility that came with such faith felt heavier than any burden she had carried before. As she continued walking, Sarah began to notice details about the business district that had escaped her attention during previous visits. The people moving purposefully along the sidewalks weren't just anonymous figures in expensive suits. They were individuals making decisions that rippled outward through the economy and society in ways both visible and hidden. Some carried themselves with the confidence of those who had found their place in this world of high stakes and high rewards. Others seemed to bear the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond their personal circumstances. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer asking how the meeting had gone. Sarah stared at the screen, realizing she had no idea how to begin explaining what had transpired. The gap between her morning self, worried about borrowing an interview outfit, and her current self, contemplating a complete reinvention of her life, seemed impossible to bridge with simple words. Instead of responding, found a quiet bench immediately. She in a small plaza between office buildings, and allowed herself to truly consider what accepting Marcus's offer would mean. Her carefully constructed routine would disappear overnight, replaced by demands and expectations she could barely imagine. The predictable struggle of balancing multiple jobs and night school would give way to challenges that couldn't be solved through simple hard work and determination. The relationships that currently anchored her life would inevitably change as well. Her roommates, her co-workers at both jobs, even her classmates at the community college, existed in a world defined by financial constraints and modest aspirations. Moving into Marcus Blackwood's orbit would create a social and economic distance that might prove impossible to bridge. She thought about Jennifer's dreams of nursing school, perpetually deferred by the demands of immediate survival, and wondered if her own sudden elevation would feel like abandonment to those she left behind. But alongside these concerns, Sarah felt something else stirring within her, a hunger she had suppressed for so long. She had almost forgotten its existence. Throughout her years of careful planning and modest goals, she had learned to contain her ambitions within the boundaries of what seemed realistic and achievable. The possibility that she might be capable of more, that her potential might extend beyond the limitations she had accepted as immutable facts, was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Her phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Sarah answered with a mixture of guilt and anticipation. Linda Jones possessed the intuitive ability of mothers everywhere to sense when their children were facing important decisions. Even across hundreds of miles and despite infrequent communication, the conversation began with the usual pleasantries about work and school, but Sarah could hear the underlying concern in her mother's voice. Linda had spent her entire adult life working in factories and cleaning offices, sacrificing her own dreams to ensure her daughter had opportunities that had never been available to her generation. The idea that Sarah might be considering abandoning the educational path they had both worked so hard to make possible would be devastating to her. Yet as Sarah listened to her mother's familiar voice, she realized that Linda's sacrifices had been made precisely to create moments like this one. The security and predictability that had defined her mother's choices had been necessary survival strategies in their circumstances, but they had also been investments in a future where different kinds of choices might become possible. When Linda asked if everything was all right, Sarah found herself sharing a carefully edited version of recent events. She described the incident at Romano's Bistro and Marcus Blackwood's unexpected intervention, though she downplayed the significance of his offer and the magnitude of the decision she was facing. Even this abbreviated account left her mother stunned, struggling to process the idea that her daughter had somehow attracted the attention of someone whose name appeared regularly in business news. The pride in Linda's voice was unmistakable, but it was tempered by worry about the risks such opportunities might entail. She had learned through hard experience that offers that seemed too good to be true often carried hidden costs, and her protective instincts were immediately activated by the prospect of her daughter venturing into unfamiliar territory without adequate preparation. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging from practical concerns about Sarah's current obligations to deeper questions about the kind of life she wanted to build for herself. Linda shared stories from her own youth, moments when she had been offered chances to take different paths but had chosen security over uncertainty. Some of these decisions she still regarded as wise, while others carried the weight of lifelong regret. By the time they hung up, Sarah had gained a new perspective on the choice before her. Her mother's sacrifices hadn't been made to ensure that Sarah would replicate her cautious approach to life, but rather to create possibilities that had never existed before. The safety net of education and steady employment that Linda had worked so hard to provide wasn't meant to be a permanent destination, but rather a foundation from which greater risks might become acceptable. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows between the buildings as Sarah finally stood up from the bench and began walking toward the community college. Her evening class in corporate finance was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, and she had initially planned to use the intervening time to review her notes and prepare for an upcoming exam. But the irony of studying theoretical business concepts while contemplating a real-world opportunity that dwarfed anything covered in her textbooks wasn't lost on her. The campus bustled with the familiar energy of students balancing work and education, their conversations peppered with complaints about demanding professors and impossible schedules. Sarah moved through these surroundings with a growing sense of disconnection, as if she were observing a world she had already begun to leave behind. The concerns that had dominated her thoughts just yesterday now seemed smaller, more manageable, yet also somehow less relevant to the person she was becoming. In the library, surrounded by students hunched over laptops and textbooks, Sarah opened her notebook and attempted to focus on the financial statements she needed to analyze for class. But the numbers on the page kept blurring as her mind returned to Marcus Blackwood's office, to the view of the city from 32 floors above the street, to the casual mention of budgets and projects that operated on scales she had never encountered before. Professor Williams entered the classroom precisely at 6 o'clock, his usual stack of papers and coffee cup in hand. He was a kind man in his early 60s who had transitioned from a corporate career to teaching, bringing real-world experience to students who rarely had opportunities to apply theoretical concepts to actual business situations. His lectures were peppered with stories from his years in management, examples that helped bridge the gap between academic study and professional practice. Tonight's topic was strategic decision-making under uncertainty, a subject that seemed almost cosmically appropriate given Sarah's current circumstances. Professor Williams began by outlining the various frameworks executives use to evaluate opportunities when complete information isn't available, discussing risk assessment, scenario planning, and the role of intuition in high-stakes choices. As he spoke about the psychological factors that influence decision-making, Sarah found herself analysing her own thought processes with new clarity. The fear that had initially dominated her reaction to Marcus's offer was gradually giving way to a more nuanced understanding of what the opportunity represented. Yes, there were risks involved in accepting his proposition, but there were also risks in declining it, costs that might only become apparent years later when other doors had closed and other possibilities had passed by. During the class break, Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Jennifer, this one more insistent in its curiosity about the afternoon's meeting. She also had missed calls from Tony at Romano's Bistro and from the manager at the coffee shop, both presumably wondering about her sudden request for time off. The practical demands of her current life were reasserting themselves, reminding her that any decision would require careful coordination with the various obligations that currently defined her existence. When class resumed, Professor Williams introduced a case study that made Sarah's breath catch. He described a young manager who had been offered a promotion that would require relocating to a different city and taking on responsibilities far beyond her previous experience. The opportunity promised accelerated career growth, but also demanded sacrifices in terms of personal relationships and familiar support systems. As her classmates analysed the various factors the fictional manager should consider, Sarah realised that the case study was essentially a mirror of her own situation, albeit on a much smaller scale. The principles remained the same: weighing known quantities against uncertain possibilities, evaluating personal values alongside professional ambitions, and ultimately making a choice that would define the trajectory of an entire life. The student sitting next to her, a woman named Patricia who worked full-time while pursuing her degree part-time, offered an analysis that resonated deeply with Sarah's current struggle. She argued that the fictional manager's decision shouldn't be based solely on rational calculations of risk and reward, but should also consider the kind of person she wanted to become and the kind of life she wanted to build. When class ended at 9 o'clock, Sarah lingered in the parking lot, reluctant to return to her apartment where the weight of her decision would be the only thing occupying her thoughts. The campus was quieter now, most of the day's students having departed hours earlier, leaving behind the dedicated few who balanced education with the demands of adult responsibilities. She thought about the community she had built here, the relationships forged through shared struggles and common goals, her study group, her favourite professors, even the staff in the financial aid office who had helped her navigate the complexities of paying for school, all represented connections that would be difficult to maintain if she accepted Marcus's offer. The thought of explaining her departure to people who had invested in her success felt almost like betrayal. Yet, as she sat in her car, staring at the modest buildings that housed her dreams of upward mobility, Sarah began to understand that those dreams themselves might have been too small. The education she was pursuing had always been a means to an end, a pathway to stability and middle-class respectability. But Marcus Blackwood was offering something far more ambitious, a chance to discover what she might be capable of when freed from the constraints of conventional expectations. The drive home took her through neighbourhoods that told the story of her city's economic geography. She passed through the working-class area where she had grown up, its modest houses and struggling businesses, a testament to the challenges faced by families like hers. Then came the transitional zone where young professionals and graduate students rented apartments while building careers, the area where she currently lived and had always expected to remain. Finally, she drove through the affluent district where Marcus Blackwood likely maintained a residence, though she had no idea which of the elegant homes behind high gates and manicured lawns might be his. The contrast between these different worlds, all existing within the same city, yet separated by invisible barriers of class and opportunity, struck her with new force. Sarah's story reminds us that courage isn't measured by the size of our stage, but by our willingness to stand up for what's right when it matters most. A single moment of integrity in a busy restaurant became the catalyst for transforming not just her own life, but revealing the character that connects us all. Sometimes the most extraordinary opportunities arrive disguised as ordinary choices, waiting for someone brave enough to defend a stranger and discover their own hidden strength. What moment of courage might be waiting in your own life, ready to change everything?